Mom always accidentally found out about my secrets and feelings that I never told anyone. I thought she had maternal intuition until I set a trap. I started keeping a diary when I was 12 years old. Back then, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, having this private space where I could pour out all my confused preteen thoughts without judgment. I remember picking out this purple notebook with a tiny lock on it from the drugstore, feeling so grown up and secretive. I'd hide it under my mattress, then behind books on my shelf, sometimes even in my winter coat pocket in the closet during summer months. What amazed me most was how my mom seemed to have this incredible sixth sense about my emotional state. I'd come home from school feeling completely devastated because some girl I had a crush on didn't even notice me at lunch, and I wouldn't say a word to anyone. But within hours, Mom would casually bring up something like how she noticed I seemed a little down and wondered if it had anything to do with that girl from my math class. She'd sit on the edge of my bed with this knowing, gentle smile and somehow know exactly what to say to make me feel better. When I was 13, I had this massive falling out with my best friend over something stupid. He borrowed my favorite video game and returned it scratched. I was furious but too embarrassed to tell anyone how much it actually hurt my feelings. I wrote pages and pages in my diary about feeling betrayed and wondering if real friendship even existed. The next morning, Mom made my favorite pancakes and started talking about how friendships go through rough patches and how important it is to communicate when someone hurts you. She even shared the story about her own childhood friend and how they worked through a similar situation. I felt so special, so understood. Here was this woman who could see straight into my soul and knew exactly what I needed to hear. My friends would complain about their parents being clueless or dismissive, but my mom got me on this deep, almost psychic level. It made me feel like we had this unique bond that other families couldn't possibly understand. The pattern continued throughout my early teens. I'd write about feeling insecure about my changing body, and she'd randomly bring up how normal it was for boys my age to feel awkward about growing up. I'd document my anxiety about upcoming tests, and she'd show up in my room with hot chocolate and study tips before I even mentioned having homework. When I started developing feelings for this girl in my English class, I filled pages with confused rambling about not knowing how to talk to her, and Mom would somehow weave advice about confidence and being yourself into completely unrelated conversations. But as I got older and my problems became more complex, something started feeling off. The timing was too perfect, her knowledge too specific. When I was 15, I wrote about this intense embarrassment I felt after tripping in the hallway in front of a group of popular kids. I described every mortifying detail, how my books scattered everywhere, how this one girl laughed, how I wanted to disappear into the floor. The next day, Mom brought up this elaborate story about resilience and how everyone has embarrassing moments, but she mentioned details that felt too close to what I'd experienced. She talked about how books falling and people laughing doesn't define who you are, using almost the exact imagery I'd written about. I started paying closer attention to these coincidences. When I wrote about feeling left out because I wasn't invited to this party that everyone else seemed to be going to, she'd bring up inclusion and social dynamics within 24 hours. When I documented my frustration with feeling like I wasn't good enough at sports compared to other guys in my grade, she'd launch into conversations about finding your own strengths and not comparing yourself to others. The conversations always felt natural in the moment. She had this gift for making it seem like she was just checking in as a caring parent, asking the right questions at the right time. But the more I noticed the pattern, the more unsettled I became. These weren't general parenting conversations, they were specifically tailored responses to thoughts I'd never shared with another human being. Update 1. I decided to test my growing suspicion by setting up what I thought was a foolproof experiment. I wrote a completely fabricated entry in my diary about stealing $20 from this classmate's backpack during gym class. I made it detailed and emotional, describing how guilty I felt but how I needed the money for something important. I wrote about being scared of getting caught and feeling like a terrible person. Then I hid the diary in a new spot inside an old shoebox in the back of my closet behind some winter clothes. 2 days later, Mom knocked on my door with this concerned expression and asked if we could talk. She sat down and started this seemingly random conversation about integrity and how sometimes when people are desperate they make choices they regret. She talked about how stealing, even small amounts, can eat away at a person's conscience and how it's never too late to make things right. She mentioned how returning something you've taken, even if it's scary, usually makes people feel so much better afterward. My blood ran cold. There was no way this was a coincidence. The timing, the specific focus on theft, the way she talked about returning money, it was too perfectly aligned with what I'd written. But what really got to me was how genuine she seemed, how concerned and loving her approach was. She wasn't accusing me or angry, she was trying to guide me toward confessing and making amends for something I hadn't even done. I felt this strange mix of vindication at being right and complete betrayal at having my privacy violated for who knows how long. But I also felt confused because her response wasn't mean-spirited or punitive. She was still being the caring, intuitive mother I'd always admired. The manipulation was so subtle and wrapped in genuine concern that it was hard to feel straightforward anger about it. That night, I wrote another fake entry about cheating on a history test and feeling terrible about it. Sure enough, within 3 days, she brought up academic honesty during dinner, talking about how cheating only hurts yourself in the long run and how teachers are usually understanding if students come forward about mistakes. She shared this story about a student she knew in college who confessed to cheating and how much better they felt afterward. The pattern was undeniable now, but I still couldn't quite believe it. This was my mother, the woman who taught me about trust and honesty, who I thought understood me better than anyone else in the world. How long had she been reading my most private thoughts? How many of those beautiful, connected moments between us had been built on her secret knowledge of my inner world? Update 2. I started keeping track of every conversation we had after I wrote in my diary, documenting the correlations in a separate notebook I kept at school. The evidence was overwhelming. But what disturbed me most wasn't just the invasion of privacy, it was how she used the information. I began to realize that she'd been shaping my decisions and emotional responses based on what she read. When I wrote about being interested in trying out for the drama club but feeling scared about performing in front of people, she'd spend the following days making subtle comments about how creativity was important and how facing fears helps people grow. When I documented feeling attracted to this boy in my chemistry class and being confused about my sexuality, she'd work conversations about acceptance and being true to yourself into our daily interactions. At first, this seemed loving and supportive. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how manipulative it actually was. She wasn't responding to cues I was giving her or creating space for me to share my feelings naturally. She was reading my private thoughts and then orchestrating conversations to guide me toward the conclusions she wanted me to reach. The worst part was how effective it had been. I'd grown up feeling like I had this incredibly intuitive, connected relationship with my mother. I thought she understood me in ways that made me special and loved. But now I had to question whether any of those feelings were genuine or if they were just the result of her having unfair access to my innermost thoughts. I decided to confront her, but I wanted to be strategic about it. I wrote one final fake entry about being offered drugs at school and feeling pressured to try them. I made it sound like I was really struggling with the decision and scared about what might happen either way. Then I waited. 3 days later, she knocked on my door after dinner. She had this worried look on her face and said she'd been thinking about how kids my age face a lot of difficult choices. She launched into this heartfelt speech about peer pressure and how drugs might seem appealing but could lead to serious consequences. She talked about how proud she was of me for always making good decisions and how she trusted me to continue doing so even when things got tough. As I sat there listening to her, I felt this profound sadness wash over me. Here was this woman who genuinely loved me and wanted to protect me, but who had been violating my privacy for years in order to do it. She thought she was being a good mother by staying connected to my emotional life, but she was actually preventing me from developing my own relationship with trust and communication. Final update. I waited until the weekend when we were both home and relaxed. I sat her down in the living room and told her I needed to talk to her about something important. I explained that I'd figured out she'd been reading my diary and that I'd tested it with fake entries to be sure. I watched her face go through this whole range of emotions: surprise, denial, guilt, and finally resignation. She didn't try to lie about it once she realized I had proof. Instead, she broke down crying and started apologizing over and over. She said she'd started reading it years ago because she was worried about me going through adolescence and wanted to make sure I was okay. She claimed she never intended for it to become a regular thing, but once she started, she felt like she was getting this valuable insight into my emotional world that helped her be a better parent. What surprised me was that she genuinely seemed to believe she'd been doing the right thing. She talked about how she'd grown up with parents who were completely disconnected from her inner life and how she'd promised herself she'd be different with her own children. She thought that by staying tuned into my thoughts and feelings, even secretly, she was showing love and preventing me from feeling alone the way she had as a teenager. But as we talked more, I could see her starting to understand why what she'd done was so harmful. I explained how it had made me question the authenticity of our entire relationship and how it had prevented me from learning to communicate my feelings naturally. I told her how violated I felt knowing that my most private thoughts had been her source material for all those seemingly intuitive conversations. The hardest part was realizing that there was no way to go back and separate which of our meaningful moments had been genuine and which had been manufactured based on her secret knowledge. Those conversations that had made me feel so understood and connected, I'd never know if they came from real maternal intuition or from her reading my diary the night before. We spent hours talking through it all. She admitted that she'd become addicted to the feeling of being the perfect, understanding mother and that reading my diary had become this compulsive behavior she couldn't stop. She justified it by telling herself it was just another form of parental monitoring, like checking my internet history or knowing where I was after school. Eventually, we worked out some new boundaries. She agreed to never read my personal writing again and to give me space to share things with her on my own timeline. I agreed to try to be more open about my feelings when I was ready to talk about them rather than keeping everything completely internal. But the trust between us was fundamentally changed. It took months before I could write in a diary again without feeling paranoid about who might read it. And it took even longer before I could accept her emotional support without wondering if she had some hidden knowledge that was informing her responses. The strangest part was that once she stopped reading my diary, she actually did seem to lose some of that seemingly magical intuition about my emotional state. Our conversations became more awkward and less perfectly timed. In some ways, this was harder to deal with because it confirmed that so much of what I'd valued about our relationship had been built on her invasion of my privacy. Looking back now, I understand that she thought she was being a loving, attentive parent. But what she actually did was teach me that privacy doesn't exist, that my inner thoughts weren't truly my own, and that the people who claim to love you might be manipulating you in ways you can't even detect. It changed how I approach relationships and trust in ways that I'm still working through years later. The saddest part is that if she'd just been patient and created genuine opportunities for connection, I probably would have shared most of those thoughts with her eventually anyway. Instead, she chose to take shortcuts that ultimately damaged the very relationship she was trying to protect.